Thank you very much, Harold, for a great presentation as well. Um, I, for one, have seen some of those Google car studies. I think they're quite interesting. Next up is our discussion Q&A, and that means we will bring each of the panelists in. I have tabled a few of the questions from the chat. You can keep putting them in now in both chat and Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But I will start with asking a couple of the questions that were direct to specific presenters in the order of presentation. And then a few questions actually superseded each presenter, and it might be great to have their input from each one of them. And I'll head to that one second. So first, Graham, we had a good broad question to get started, which is, can any of your sensors be used for more than just public awareness? And kind of attached to that, is your download tool available to just anyone?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer the second question first. And the download tool and the community reporter are currently publicly available at this time. However, we hope to make them publicly available in the near future. In terms of what the sensors can be used for, there's a framework that was developed by the EPA that's in their air sensors guidebook, and they have a number of tiers and sort of accuracy and precision requirements to fit a sensor within that tier. And the purple airs, they actually perform pretty well if they're properly calibrated. You might compare them to, a reference nephelometer, which is basically a much more expensive version of the purple air used by some air agencies. And, I've taken a look at that, and they seem to perform definitely within the bounds of educational use and possibly even useful for supplemental monitoring, sort of filling in gaps in regulatory networks and helping to give us an idea. For example, if we're forecasting, if a wildfire is coming in, we can see that 1 minute data. We have a lot more sensors, so we know that it's coming from this direction or right here, right there. They can't really be used for, enforcement, compliance, or regulatory action. But there is some power in having communities being able to put up these sensors and come to government agencies with data that they've collected that highlights, their concerns.
Great, thank you for that. One question we got was, are the purple air sensors all sited or deployed by your agency, or do you also include perhaps any publicly sited citizen sensors as well?
Yeah, so that map includes all sensors within our area, including citizen science, people, just individuals who've purchased them, other groups. We have deployed about a dozen purple air sensors ourselves, and we have loaned out about that many to people in the region as well. And, we've used them for short-term studies, trying to look at what's happening in a specific area, as well as trying to just get more information about how they perform by citing them with our regulatory monitors.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Angela a couple of questions now from your presentation. The first one we got was, what components are you measuring with your air sensors?
We're measuring only particulate matter, so PM1, 2.5, and 10.
And then also shortly thereafter was, what kind of air monitors were you using? For instance, were they custom, or did you happen to find one that's publicly available?
So these are built, the monitors are built by SafeCast volunteers, or were kind of conceived of and developed by SafeCast volunteers using components that are publicly available. We're using right now the Plant Tower 7000 series in the SolarCast that we were talking about in the 2016-17 deployments. Those were, we were testing Plant Tower 5000 series against the AlphaSense. So we were trying to see what sensors worked best and reliability and how they work together, how they could reference each other. Great.
Now, I do have a type of a broader question here. How do you ensure that you can trust your own data, was asked. Is there a process for that in terms of your calibration and verification, especially since you're making your own types of sensors?
Well, I mean, our sensors are not different from commercially available sensors. Um, they're produced in small batches, as opposed to, say, our radiation kit sensors that are sold and put together by individuals. The air quality monitors that are uploading data onto the site are using standardized equipment. So, and they're put together, you know, in groups. Once people have them, they can cite them anywhere that they like, and then they can turn them on and they automatically upload data. So I think there was a question about, you know, people without training being able to do that. Well, they're able to do that because it's a, you know, drop and go sort of situation.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think that one of the questions about kind of enlisting volunteer help, how do you ensure standardized data quality in a project like SafeCast?
Well, like I said, it's not the person that is actually collecting. Actually, what's really important for SafeCast is that you're participating in the collection and you're participating in the monitoring, in the looking and reviewing at the data. So really, your participation in collecting the data is citing it, posting a monitor, and then making sure that, you know, it doesn't have spiders crawling into the system, or that it's if it looks like the data is starting to be a little out of whack with other sensors in the area, that you would check it and make sure that it is clean and things like that. But it's a way of making sure that non-technical people can interact with the actual machine. But what's important is the data coming from the machine, that they interact with the data coming from the machine.
Thank you. We had a question from Tiffany. For the SafeCast AQ monitoring in 2020 at public libraries, how were you able to obtain city permission to place the monitors at the library? And was there any pushback?
Of course. So what we did is we worked with the Los Angeles Public Library and found a grant to apply for that would look at hosting the monitors at the individual branches that we talked about, the 23 branches. And then also SafeCast will be working with libraries to train the librarians, which will then host the community groups inside those branches. So really, it's SafeCast support is in helping average people be able to look at, work with, and use the data, not just understand it as happening in their environment.
Right. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Harold a couple of questions before we get a chance to ask a question for the entire panel. I have one from Tiffany as well. Have you seen a community drive one of the data action pathways that you listed? Are there documented examples where we could look to better understand what motivated the community and what steps were taken in order to effectively advocate for policy change? That might be kind of a question for that great guide you produced. Have you seen anybody use it successfully?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question, Tiffany. You know, I think the community lens is one that's very important. We first started talking about the importance of the monitoring networks and the grade of sensors, right? So if you're talking low cost sensor grade, more for public awareness, and then your FEM, FRM, more for regulatory and compliance, you know, starting that initial conversation with city leaders or cities and communities was very important for us to identify what their goals were. So, you know, I feel like as large organizations, oftentimes we work with different community groups, or when we apply for NSF grant, NIH grant, we come with our predefined goals and objectives and reach out to communities to see if they want to be partners. But we try and kind of do an inverse of that, you know, starting with primarily a needs assessment, in communities to get an idea of what information is most pertinent to their quality of life, right? And moving from that, essentially doing things like amenity mapping, disamenity mapping to look to see what allies and resources are in the community. Because ideally what you don't want to do is to develop a project where, you know, you end up having to be the technical arm, on the ground support. What you want to do is develop different resources that you can leave behind and support different communities and organizations, right? So if those are modules, different infographics, presentations, and the like, that can support these different communities. So that's a lot of what we did in some of our work in West Oakland. I actually have a training later today with some data to action groups in Houston where we're starting at square one. They've developed their community action plans, and over the course of the next 6 months, we'll be putting that into action under the context of COVID and everything that's going on. It's been very difficult, but I think one thing, if I've said a lot, I just want to conclude on being responsive to the needs of the actual community and using that to guide those data to action pathways. So the work in Oakland around the ports was clearly linked to cases, clearly linked to homes and schools and churches that were impacted by the pollution. And we used that to drive our decision making in the program plan itself.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that you added that. We talk about sensors and people who like to participate in the projects. And the people come with their own stories too, which is why they'd like to participate in research. Brian Stacy has a question about the Breathe London network. He thinks it's very interesting. One is the interesting use of CO2 measurements to assess changing emission indices. CO2 is not traditionally an air pollutant, a climate change gas. Do you see hyperlocal CO2 monitoring becoming more common in the future?
Thanks for that question, Brian. You know, I think our inclinations when we approach these different projects with city leaders is you have to, in a sense, meet them where they are. You know, we're in the air pollution space. You know, terms like black carbon, particulate matter, NOx, SOx, they resonate with us. But when we're really trying to have this climate discussion around resilience in communities, CO2 is one of those GHG emissions that really is a way that we can have that active conversation with city leaders. Although they may not care as much about air pollution, if you word it or if you identify these kind of co-benefits, then it makes a better stick and can support resiliency funding. I say all that to say, you know, we tested for NO2, you know, ozone, CO2, PM, black carbon, the different pollutants in the Breathe London network. We're really where we saw substantial reductions or in the NOx emissions and NO2 emissions. More specific, obviously, to transportation sources and mobile sources. PM, we didn't see as, I would say, a distinct reduction, obviously, because you have more impacting factors like background sources that may blow in or resuspension and coagulation from particles in that network. But CO2 was also a surrogate that we use as just a specific point of contact to really have that lead in and have that conversation actively with city leaders. And then we prime them later with NO2 and PM as some surrogate pollutants to include in that conversation. I mean, I could see a benefit in CO2 being a tool, maybe long-term in hyperlocal monitoring. But as we think about just legacy source points and regions and looking at emissions inventories and how we can really zoom in on different chemicals, if it's VOCs or NOx emissions from vehicles, I think I want to kind of stick with some of those more criteria pollutants as surrogates for now.
Thank you for that answer. All right, so we have only about 2 more minutes, so I'm going to ask one great question that has come up in a couple of different webinars like this, and it's about data provenance. Specifically, if you learn that one sensor is failing or sitting next to a pollution source and corrupted data, how do you let other users know that information about that sensor? In other words, what information are you collecting about your data, and then how are you disseminating it with people you'd like to share that information? I'd like to start with Angela, if that's okay. Are you also collecting metadata and data provenance features?
Well, in answer to the, you know, what would it be like to show data from a pollution source? I mean, I think we're actually interested in that, and having monitors take over time readings and not be mobile you can really go deep with when pollution happens and how that's affecting areas. So I think those are interesting readings still. But in terms of finding like hotspots, it would be better to actually have a mobile sensor to find hotspots, to go around and see what's going on in a neighborhood. And then a lot of times what we found is that people will use a mobile sensor like an air beam to find what's going on in their neighborhood and then have those questions, and then they can determine where to put the long-term sensors that they want to have in a community. So that actually, I think that there's a way that sensor types can work together and in looking at that. And so I hope that kind of comes a little bit to your provenance question in terms of how sensors start to deteriorate. I think we're looking at that and we're trying to figure out different ways to address that. And we know that that it does happen. When we see it happening, we ask people to check the monitor first and to either check is it powered correctly and things like that. I'll let some of the other people jump in too.
Thank you, Angela. Graham, do you have any insights on David Providence?
Sure. I will answer for the sensor map and the QC that's done on the purple air sensors. And basically a lot of that's done in the background. There are a number of flags that can be applied if there's a certain problem that's noticed by the QC algorithms. Currently, that's not publicly available on the map. There's been a little bit of interest in that, but I could see in terms of transparency that it would be important to have not only your raw data, but all the transformations that have happened to it and make that available.
Great, thank you very much. Well, right about now is a great time for us to thank our presenters, Graham, Angela, and very wonderful presentations.